The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the rolling Missouri hills as Sarah Baker pulled her dusty black SUV into the gravel parking lot of the Route 66 griddle stop. She had been on the road for hours. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the highway is soothing, if monotonous, soundtrack to her solo journey. The diner stood alone on this stretch of road, a relic of a bygone era, with its neon sign flickering against the backdrop of an open sky. Sarah stepped out of the car and stretched her lean, muscular frame, silhouetted in the waning light. Dressed simply in a navy blue hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, she looked like any other traveler stopping for a quick meal. She reached for her backpack on the passenger seat, the weight of its contents a comforting reminder of the preparedness she carried wherever she went. Inside the diner, the smell of sizzling bacon and strong coffee mingled with the faint scent of old linoleum. A bell above the door jingled as Sarah entered, drawing the attention of the sparse, late afternoon crowd. The conversations at a few scattered booths hushed briefly, replaced by curious or wary glances, before the room returned to its low hum of activity. Sarah walked to the counter and sat on one of the cracked leather stools. A young waitress, barely out of her teens, approached nervously, clutching a notepad. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice polite but strained. "Just a coffee and a burger," Sarah replied, offering a small smile. The waitress nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Sarah to scan the room. A group of bikers sat in the far corner, their leather jackets adorned with patches and a logo that read, Iron Talons MC. Their loud laughter and coarse language filled the diner as they leaned over their table, casting glances her way. She ignored them, her focus shifting to the old jukebox in the corner, its playlist of rock classics a nostalgic reminder of simpler times. Her coffee arrived, the steam curling up invitingly, and Sarah sipped it slowly, savoring the warmth. "Hey, sweetheart, you lost?" The voice was gravelly and carried the weight of a challenge. Sarah didn't need to turn around to know it came from one of the bikers, the leader, by the sound of it. His tone dripped with mockery, and she could feel his gaze burning into the back of her head. "No," Sarah replied without looking up. Her voice was calm, steady, but her sharp instincts had already cataloged the details of the room, the exits, the number of patrons, the positions of the bikers. The man didn't take the hint. He sauntered over, his boots clunking heavily against the floor. The other bikers snickered, egging him on. "What's a pretty little thing like you doing out here, all alone?" he asked, leaning on the counter next to her. His breath smelled of cheap beer and stale cigarettes. Sarah met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "Just grabbing a bite," she said, her tone neutral. He smirked, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Well, you picked the wrong place, lady. We don't get too many of your kind out here." The diner fell silent again, the weight of his words settling heavily in the room. Sarah's grip on her coffee mug tightened imperceptibly, but her face remained calm. "Your kind?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "You know what I mean," he said, his smirk widening as the other bikers chuckled. The waitress emerged from the kitchen, carrying Sarah's plate, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. "Here you go," she whispered, darting a nervous glance at the biker before retreating to the safety of the counter. Sarah picked up the burger and took a deliberate bite, her eyes never leaving the man's face. "Thanks for the warm welcome," she said dryly. The biker's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of confusion at her unflinching demeanor. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You'd better watch yourself. People around here don't take kindly to outsiders who don't know their place." Sarah set her burger down and met his gaze squarely. Her voice was low, calm, but there was a steel edge to it. "I know exactly where I am, and I'd suggest you keep your distance." The room seemed to hold its breath as the biker stared at her, weighing her words. Finally, he chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, straightening up. "But don't think for a second this is over." He walked back to his table, his heavy boots echoing in the silence. The other bikers jeered and laughed, their voices carrying the promise of trouble. Sarah finished her meal in silence, her focus unwavering. As she paid her bill and walked out, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the parking lot bathed in the dim glow of the diner's flickering neon sign. As she climbed into her car, she noticed the bikers stepping outside, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. They leaned against their motorcycles, watching her with predatory grins. Sarah paused, her hand on the steering wheel, and glanced at them through the rearview mirror. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Big mistake, she murmured to herself, starting the engine. And with that, she drove off, leaving the diner and the first taste of trouble behind. The hum of the engine was a steady companion as Sarah Baker drove down the winding highway, the Missouri night stretching out ahead of her. The road was quiet, flanked by dense forests on either side. She kept her eyes on the asphalt, but her mind lingered on the encounter at the diner. Years of training had taught her to trust her instincts, and tonight, every fiber of her being told her she wasn't alone. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. At first, they seemed harmless, just another traveler on the road, but as the minutes ticked by, the lights didn't fade or pass. They stayed there, a steady presence, keeping pace. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. Sarah eased off the gas, letting her car slow down just enough to test her theory. The headlights behind her mirrored her speed, maintaining their distance but not overtaking her. "Here we go," she muttered under her breath, her calm exterior masking the flicker of tension beneath. The highway stretched on, the silence broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant rustling of the trees. Sarah considered her options. She wasn't far from her motel, but heading there now would be a mistake. She didn't want to lead them to where she was staying. Instead, she took a sudden right turn onto a dirt road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. The headlights followed. Sarah exhaled slowly, her thoughts sharpening into focus. She had been in situations like this before, trailing a target through hostile territory, waiting for them to make the first move. Only this time, the roles were reversed, and she wasn't the predator, not yet. The dirt road led to a small clearing, a wide-open space surrounded by trees. Sarah pulled her car to a stop, turning off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of gravel as the pursuing vehicle approached. A black pickup truck came into view, its headlights blazing as it rolled to a stop a few yards away. The engine rumbled for a moment before cutting out. Sarah stayed in her car, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. She could make out the silhouettes of 3 figures stepping out of the truck. Even without seeing their faces, she recognized them, the bikers from the diner. The leader, Keegan, spoke first, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Well, look who decided to take the scenic route. Thought you could lose us, lady." Sarah didn't respond. She reached into her backpack and retrieved her phone, sending a quick text to a friend in law enforcement, a precaution, just in case. Then, she slipped it into her pocket and opened the car door. As she stepped out, the cool night air wrapped around her. She stood tall, her calm expression betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady. The bikers exchanged glances, their smirks illuminated by the truck's headlights. Keegan took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "We just wanted to talk," he said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. "You didn't seem very friendly back at the diner." Sarah folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. Following someone down a dark road doesn't exactly scream friendly, does it? Another biker, a burly man with a shaved head, laughed. "She's got a mouth on her, Keegan. I like that." Keegan raised a hand, silencing him. His eyes locked on Sarah's, and his smirk twisted into something colder. "You don't get it, do you? People like you don't just stroll through places like this without consequences." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "People like me? You know what I mean," Keegan spat. "You don't belong here. You think you can walk into our space, act like you're better than us." Sarah's face remained impassive, but her voice sharpened. "I didn't bother you. You made this my business, and now you're going to regret it." The air grew heavier, the tension crackling like static electricity. Keegan took another step closer, his hand brushing against the handle of a knife strapped to his belt. "Is that so?" Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deliberate step forward, closing the gap between them. Her voice dropped, low and dangerous. "Walk away now." The third biker, younger and less sure of himself, glanced at Keegan. "Maybe we should." "Shut up," Keegan snapped, his temper flaring. He turned back to Sarah, his eyes blazing with anger. "You don't tell me what to do." Sarah's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Suit yourself." In an instant, Keegan lunged, his knife flashing in the dim light. But Sarah was faster. She sidestepped his attack with ease, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as Keegan let out a pained grunt. The other bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as they watched Keegan drop to his knees. Sarah didn't let go. She held his wrist in an iron grip, her voice calm but firm. "I warned you," she said. "Now you've got one chance to leave before this gets worse." She released Keegan, who stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. But he didn't move to attack again. The other bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. "This isn't over," Keegan growled, his voice a low snarl. Sarah stepped back, her gaze unwavering. "It is if you're smart, but something tells me you're not." The bikers retreated to their truck, muttering curses under their breath. Keegan shot her a venomous glare before climbing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and the truck sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Sarah stood in the clearing for a moment, listening to the fading sound of the truck. Her heartbeat slowed, and she took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline ebb away. As she climbed back into her car, she glanced at her phone. The message she had sent earlier showed a reply. "Got your location. Call if you need backup." Sarah smiled faintly, her fingers tapping out a quick response. "Not yet. I've got this." She started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, her calm composure hiding the storm brewing beneath the surface. The bikers thought they had the upper hand, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Not yet. The motel sat at the edge of a sleepy town, its neon vacancy sign flickering like a tired sentinel. Sarah Baker parked her SUV in the farthest corner of the lot, where the streetlight's beam didn't quite reach. She turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, scanning her surroundings. The night was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Sarah glanced at it. "Need me to send someone?" It was from Peter Jones, her old Navy SEAL teammate, now a sergeant with the local police. Sarah smirked faintly, her fingers moving deftly over the screen. "Not yet. I'll let you know." She placed the phone in her pocket, grabbed her backpack, and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she approached her room. Her instincts were on high alert, every shadow and sound dissected by her trained mind. The door to her room creaked slightly as she unlocked it and stepped inside. The space was sparse and dated. A single bed with a faded quilt, a small table with a scratched lamp, and a TV bolted to the wall. Sarah locked the door behind her and checked the windows, ensuring the curtains were drawn tight. She dropped her backpack onto the table and unzipped it, revealing its carefully organized contents. A tactical flashlight, a small first aid kit, protein bars, a sturdy multi-tool, and a sleek combat knife. Monica didn't need much, but what she had, she knew how to use. After a quick shower, she sat cross-legged on the bed, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. Keegan's snarling face flashed before her eyes, his arrogance almost comical in hindsight. But Sarah knew men like him. His pride had been bruised, and men like him didn't let that go easily. A faint sound broke her thoughts, a distant rumble. She froze, her senses sharpening. The sound grew louder, distinct now. Motorcycles. Sarah moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see the parking lot. 3 bikes rolled in, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched Keegan and his crew dismount. They moved with purpose, their voices low but aggressive. Keegan carried a crowbar, while the others held bats and chains. Sarah's mind clicked into gear. The motel was deserted, the only other occupied room's lights dark. She had purposely chosen a quiet spot to avoid distractions, but now, that isolation worked against her. Or maybe it didn't. The bikers moved toward her SUV first, their silhouettes visible in the dim light. Keegan raised the crowbar and swung it at the windshield. The glass shattered with a loud crash. The sound echoed through the night, but the isolation of the area ensured no one would come running. Sarah stepped back from the window, her mind calculating. She could confront them now, but Keegan wanted that. He wanted her to come out angry, make mistakes. No, she would wait. She would choose the moment. The bikers moved toward her door, their boots heavy on the gravel. Keegan barked orders, his voice low but commanding. One of the younger bikers, the same one who had hesitated earlier, looked uneasy. "Keegan, maybe we should just leave," he muttered. "Shut up," Keegan snapped. "We're finishing this." They reached the door, and Keegan raised his crowbar, slamming it against the wood. "Come on out, lady," he yelled. "Let's see how tough you really are." Sarah stood in the shadowed corner of the room, calm and deliberate. Her backpack was on the bed, its contents ready. She slid the combat knife into its sheath on her belt and clipped the flashlight to her pocket. Keegan slammed the door again, splintering the wood. "You've got 5 seconds before we come in." Sarah smiled faintly to herself. "You'll regret that." When the door finally gave way, Keegan charged in first, his crowbar raised. The dim room and broken lock made him overconfident, and he didn't notice the small, dark shape crouched behind the dresser. Sarah moved like a shadow, silent and precise. As Keegan passed her, she struck a calculated blow to the back of his knee with the butt of her knife. He dropped to the ground with a yell, his weapon clattering to the floor. The second biker stumbled in, his bat raised. Sarah grabbed his wrist and twisted, disarming him before delivering a sharp elbow to his chest. He gasped, falling back against the wall. The third biker hesitated at the door, his chain swinging loosely in his hand. His face was pale, his earlier bravado gone. "You want to try your luck?" Sarah asked, her voice low and steady. He took a step back, shaking his head. I didn't sign up for this." "Smart," Sarah replied. "Now get out." The young biker didn't wait for another word. He dropped the chain and bolted into the night, the sound of his retreating footsteps fading quickly. Keegan groaned on the floor, clutching his leg, while the second biker scrambled toward the door, dragging himself out. Sarah turned to Keegan, crouching beside him. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her tone cold. "You're going to leave. You're going to tell every one of your little friends that you don't come after people who've done nothing to you. And if I ever see you again, it won't end with just a bruised ego." Keegan glared at her, his jaw tight with pain and humiliation. "You think you can scare me?" Sarah leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't need to scare you. You'll scare yourself once you realize what you're dealing with." She stood, her imposing figure casting a shadow over him. "Get out." Keegan struggled to his feet, hobbling toward the door. Sarah followed him, watching as he and his remaining companions stumbled toward their bikes. The engines roared to life, and moments later, the parking lot was empty again. Sarah locked the broken door as best as she could and returned to her room. Her pulse had already slowed, her mind clear. She knew Keegan wouldn't let this go. Men like him never did. But next time, it wouldn't be in the shadows. Next time, she'd be ready. As Sarah sat on the bed, her phone buzzed again. "Everything good?" She typed her response. "For now. Keep an ear out." The night stretched on, silent once more, but Sarah knew better than to trust silence. The early morning sun stretched pale fingers over the horizon, painting the Missouri sky in shades of amber and rose. Sarah Blake sat at the small motel room table, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. She had barely slept, but her mind was sharp, dissecting every moment from the night before. Her SUV sat battered in the parking lot, the shattered windshield catching the light in jagged reflections. The motel's silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of a highway truck. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She could feel it. The storm wasn't over. She had seen men like Keegan before, prideful, dangerous, and unwilling to accept defeat. This wasn't just about a bruised ego for him anymore. It was about reclaiming his authority, proving something to himself and his crew. Sarah didn't know when the next move would come, but she knew it would be bigger, louder, and far more dangerous. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. "Peter Jones, saw the report on your SUV. Want me to swing by?" Sarah smirked faintly, appreciating his vigilance. She tapped out a response. "Sarah, not yet. Just keeping you in the loop." A moment later, another buzz. Peter understood. "Watch your 6." After finishing her coffee, Sarah stood and began organizing her belongings. She worked methodically, packing her gear and leaving no trace of her presence beyond the broken door. The motel manager hadn't asked questions when she paid for the damages in cash that morning. That suited her just fine. By 8 a.m., Sarah was on the road again, her SUV's cracked windshield a glaring reminder of the events she was leaving behind. She drove east, toward a small nearby town, hoping to get it repaired before Keegan or his crew caught up with her. The repair shop was a modest, family-owned business called Carter's Auto and Glass. Sarah parked in the lot and stepped inside, where an older man with silver hair and oil-stained hands greeted her warmly. "Morning, ma'am. What can I do for you?" Sarah gestured toward her SUV. "Windshield needs replacing." Had a bit of trouble last night. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't press. We can take care of that for you. Might take a couple of hours, though. You're welcome to wait here. Thanks, Sarah said, handing over her keys. She settled into a plastic chair in the corner of the small waiting area, her senses still on high alert. 2 hours later, Sarah's SUV was as good as new. She paid for the repairs and thanked the mechanic before heading back onto the road. She didn't go far, though. Instead, she parked at a diner just a mile away from the repair shop, ordering a light lunch and taking her time to observe her surroundings. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It was unlikely Keegan would make his move here, not with so many witnesses. But Sarah knew better than to underestimate desperation. As she ate, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. We're not done with you yet, lady. Sarah stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. The message was anonymous, but the tone was unmistakable. She put the phone down and exhaled slowly. She could run, leave the area and let Keegan stew in his anger, but that wasn't her style. Sarah had spent her life facing challenges head-on, and she wasn't about to let a pack of bikers change that. By late afternoon, Sarah returned to the motel, her repaired SUV parked once again in the shadows of the lot. She spent the next few hours preparing, ensuring she was ready for whatever came next. Her gear was laid out methodically on the small table, a tactical flashlight, her combat knife, a makeshift first aid kit, and a small, discreet pistol she kept for emergencies. She had no intention of escalating the situation, but if Keegan and his crew came looking for a fight, she wouldn't be caught off guard. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah stood at the window, watching the parking lot. The motel was quiet, the other rooms still vacant. Her phone buzzed again. Peter Jones. Anything yet? Sarah. No movement. I'll keep you posted. The hours crawled by, the weight of anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Sarah remained vigilant, her every sense attuned to the faintest sound. When the distant growl of motorcycles finally reached her ears, it wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation. The rumble grew louder, more distinct. This time, it wasn't just 3 bikes. Sarah moved to the window, her sharp eyes counting at least 6 headlights cutting through the darkness. The group was larger, their movements more deliberate. The bikes rolled into the lot, forming a loose semicircle around her SUV. The engines died, and Keegan stepped forward, flanked by his men. His sneer was more pronounced this time, his posture oozing false confidence. Sarah opened the door and stepped out, her figure silhouetted against the dim motel lights. She kept her hands at her sides, her movements measured. Back again, Keegan, she said calmly. Keegan chuckled, the sound hollow. You didn't think we'd let you off that easy, did you? His men fanned out, their weapons glinting faintly in the light. Bats, chains, and crowbars, an arsenal meant to intimidate. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. You brought more friends this time. Smart move. Won't help, though. Keegan's smirk faltered, his bravado flickering under her steady gaze. We'll see about that. Sarah took a step forward, her voice dropping to a quiet warning. This is your last chance, Keegan. Walk away. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence wavering. Keegan's grip on his crowbar tightened, his jaw clenching. You think you're untouchable, he spat. You don't know who you're messing with. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile, her voice steady and cold. Neither do you. The tension in the air was electric, the clearing quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves. Sarah knew the storm was about to break, and this time, she wouldn't just weather it, she'd end it. The cool night air was thick with tension as Sarah Blake stood in the parking lot, facing Keegan and his crew. The group had nearly doubled in size, 6 bikers now forming a loose semicircle around her SUV. Their bikes, sleek and menacing, sat idling behind them, their headlights casting long, ominous shadows. Keegan stepped forward, his crowbar swinging loosely in his hand. His face was a mask of smug confidence, but Sarah could see the cracks, his pride still stung from their last encounter. You've got guts, lady, he said, his voice carrying over the still night. I'll give you that. But tonight, we settle this. Sarah didn't flinch. Her posture was calm, her hands resting casually at her sides. She let the silence stretch, her measured gaze moving from Keegan to each of his men. Their faces told a story. Some were eager, others uncertain. The younger biker, who had fled the night before, stood at the back, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting nervously. I warned you, Keegan, Sarah said, her voice steady. You had your chance to walk away. Keegan sneered. You don't get to warn me. You're the one who doesn't belong here. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. And what exactly do you think is going to happen here? Keegan's smirk widened, but his bravado was forced. He gestured to his crew. We're going to teach you a lesson you won't forget. One of the bikers, a stocky man with a scar running down his cheek, laughed. You're outnumbered, sweetheart. Maybe it's time to back down. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched. Keegan's patience snapped. He lunged forward, his crowbar swinging in a wide arc. Sarah moved like water, sidestepping the blow with precision. Before Keegan could recover, she struck a calculated blow to his forearm, sending the crowbar clattering to the ground. The suddenness of her move sent a ripple of uncertainty through the group. She's fast, one of them muttered, his confidence faltering. Shut up and get her, Keegan barked, clutching his arm. The bikers surged forward as a group, their weapons raised. Sarah didn't hesitate. She moved with the fluidity of years of Navy SEAL training, her body a weapon honed by experience. The first biker swung a bat, aiming for her ribs. Sarah ducked, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground with a grunt, his bat rolling away. The second came at her with a chain, the metal glinting in the light. Sarah caught it mid-swing, twisting it around her wrist and yanking it hard. The man stumbled forward, off balance, and she delivered a sharp elbow to his jaw. He crumpled to the ground. Keegan watched in stunned silence, his earlier confidence now replaced by a flicker of fear. The fight continued in a blur of calculated movements. Sarah's focus was razor-sharp, each move deliberate and efficient. She disarmed the third and fourth bikers in quick succession, their weapons clattering to the asphalt. But by the time she faced the last two, the air was heavy with the sound of labored breathing and muffled groans. Keegan and the younger biker stood frozen, their confidence shattered. You still want to finish this? Sarah asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. The younger biker took a step back, shaking his head. No, I'm out. I'm done. He turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Keegan was alone now, his bravado completely gone. He looked around at his fallen crew, his face pale. Why you think you've won? He stammered, his voice trembling. You don't know who I am. Sarah stepped closer, her presence commanding. She stopped inches from him, her gaze piercing. I know exactly who you are, she said, her voice low. You're a bully, a coward who hides behind numbers and cheap intimidation. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Keegan's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. You have two choices, Sarah continued. Leave now and never come back, or wait here for the cops. Your call. The sound of distant sirens broke the tension. Keegan's eyes widened as he looked toward the highway. You called the cops? He spat. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile. What did you think was going to happen, Keegan? You come after me, you get consequences. The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of patrol cars now visible in the distance. Keegan's breath quickened, his earlier defiance crumbling. This isn't over, he hissed, taking a step back. It is, Sarah said firmly. You just don't know it yet. Keegan turned and ran, his heavy boots pounding against the asphalt as he disappeared into the night. The patrol cars rolled into the lot moments later, their lights painting the scene in red and blue. Peter Jones stepped out of the lead car, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Sarah, he said, approaching her. You okay? Sarah nodded, her breathing steady. I'm fine. They're scattered now. Keegan ran. Peter glanced at the bikers still groaning on the ground. You didn't make it easy for them, did you? They gave me no choice, Sarah replied. Peter smirked. We'll pick up Keegan soon enough. His kind always makes mistakes. As the officers began rounding up the bikers, Sarah leaned against her SUV, the tension finally easing from her shoulders. She watched the scene unfold, her mind already shifting to the next step. This wasn't over, not entirely. But for now, the storm had passed, and Sarah Blake stood, unshaken, in its wake. The parking lot of the motel was quieter now, the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol cars casting long, shifting shadows over the asphalt. Officers moved methodically, cuffing Keegan's remaining crew and loading them into the back seats of their vehicles. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, mingled with the faint, metallic tang of blood where a biker had hit the ground hard. Sarah Blake stood near her SUV, her arms crossed over her chest. The adrenaline that had powered her through the confrontation had ebbed, leaving her with a cool, measured focus. She kept her eyes on the scene, tracking every movement as the officers secured the area. Peter Jones approached her, his notepad tucked into his back pocket. His uniform was neat, his expression one of practiced composure, but there was a flicker of personal concern in his eyes. "They're rounding up Keegan's crew," he said, stopping a few feet away from her. "Most of them are keeping their mouths shut, but we've got enough to hold them on assault and vandalism." Sarah nodded. "Good. They're not the type to learn until they face real consequences." Peter studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp. "You sure you're okay? They didn't manage to get a hit in, did they?" "I'm fine," Sarah replied evenly. "They were predictable, sloppy." He smirked faintly. "That's your polite way of saying they didn't stand a chance, isn't it?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Something like that." As the officers finished loading the bikers into the cars, Keegan's voice carried across the lot. You think this is over?" he shouted, struggling against the officer holding him. "You think you've won?" Sarah turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto him. Keegan's face was flushed with anger, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wild. Despite the cuffs on his wrists, he still radiated the stubborn defiance of a man who refused to accept defeat. Peter glanced at Sarah. "Want me to handle him?" She shook her head, stepping forward. "No, I'll take care of it." Sarah stopped a few feet from Keegan, her posture calm but commanding. The officers gave her space, their hands still firm on Keegan's arms. "This isn't over," Keegan hissed, his voice low but venomous. Sarah's expression didn't change. "You're right about one thing. It's not over. But not in the way you think." His eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means your choices brought you here," she said, her tone cold and measured. "And every move you make from this point on will dig you deeper. You can keep pretending you're in control, or you can start to think about the life you want when you're out of a jail cell. Your call." Keegan glared at her, his jaw tight. For a moment, it seemed like he might spit another insult, but instead, he looked away, muttering under his breath. Sarah turned back to Peter. "Get him out of here. He's wasted enough of my time." Peter nodded, signaling the officers to load Keegan into the car. The door slammed shut with finality, and Sarah watched as the vehicles pulled out of the lot, their sirens off, the only sound the crunch of gravel under their tires. The silence that followed was almost jarring. The parking lot, once filled with chaos and noise, was now still. Sarah leaned against her SUV, her eyes on the horizon. Peter walked back over to her. "You handled that well," he said. "Most people would have lost their cool." "Most people don't have my training," she replied. Peter chuckled. "Fair point." He paused, studying her for a moment. "You're not sticking around, are you?" Sarah shook her head. "No. Keegan's out of the picture for now, but he's not the only one. Men like him always have connections. I'm not giving them another chance to find me." Peter's expression darkened. "If you need backup, I know where to find you," Sarah said, her voice softer now. "Thanks, Peter, for showing up when you did." He nodded. "You don't have to thank me. Just stay safe, all right?" By the time Sarah returned to her room, the adrenaline had fully worn off, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. She locked the door behind her, sliding a chair under the handle for good measure. The small room felt even quieter now, the faint hum of the air conditioner the only sound. She sat at the edge of the bed, her elbows resting on her knees, her hands clasped. Her mind wandered back to Keegan's words, the venom in his tone. "You think this is over?" Sarah knew it wasn't, not entirely. Keegan would stew in his cell, planning his next move, or maybe his connections would step in, trying to salvage what was left of their crew's reputation. Either way, Sarah would be ready. She reached for her phone and typed a quick message to a contact she hadn't spoken to in months. "Need to touch base. Might have a situation brewing. Call me when you can." The response came faster than she expected. "Understood. Let's connect tomorrow. Stay sharp." Sarah set the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, exhaling deeply. She wasn't afraid of what was coming, not anymore. But she knew better than to let her guard down. As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the curtains, Sarah closed her eyes, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion. For now, she could rest. Tomorrow, she'd be ready for whatever came next. The early morning sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting long streaks of gold across the floor. Sarah Blake sat at the small table by the window, her coffee steaming in front of her. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup absently as her eyes focused on the quiet parking lot outside. The remnants of the previous night's chaos had been swept away. No sirens, no bikers, no lingering threats. But Sarah knew better than to trust the calm. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a message from her contact, Thomas Hayes, a former intelligence officer she'd worked with on covert missions years ago. Thomas, can talk now. Secure line. Sarah reached into her backpack and pulled out a compact, encrypted satellite phone. It was a relic from her SEAL days, but she maintained it meticulously, knowing there might come a time when she'd need it. She dialed Thomas's number and waited, the faint hum of the secure connection filling the silence. Blake, Thomas's familiar voice greeted her. He had the same no-nonsense tone she remembered, tempered with a quiet warmth that only surfaced with people he trusted. What's going on? Got into a situation, Sarah said, her voice even. Small-time gang, led by someone who doesn't know when to quit. Things escalated faster than I expected. Keegan, Thomas asked, his voice sharp with recognition. Sarah's brow furrowed. You've heard of him? He's not as small-time as he looks, Thomas replied. The Iron Talons have been expanding, taking over smaller groups across the region. Keegan's been the face of their recruitment push. Word is he's got backing from someone higher up, someone with money and connections. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. You think he's part of something bigger? Could be, Thomas said. Or he's just a useful pawn for someone who is. Either way, he won't take losing to you lightly. Men like him see humiliation as a debt they have to repay. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. What do you know about his crew? Mostly low-level thugs, Thomas said. But Keegan's got a reputation for being ruthless when it comes to protecting his territory. If he's gunning for you, he won't stop at just showing up with a few more bikers. He'll escalate. Sarah exhaled slowly. She had expected retaliation, but knowing Keegan had connections beyond his gang added a new layer of complexity. What's your play? Thomas asked, his tone quieter now. For now, I'm ahead of him, Sarah said. But if he comes for me again, I'm not waiting for the next move. I'm shutting him down. Careful, Blake, Thomas warned. You're not in uniform anymore. The rules are different out here. I know, Sarah replied. But some things don't change. He came after me first. I'm just finishing what he started. There was a long pause on the line before Thomas spoke again. If you need backup, you call me. No hesitation. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile. I appreciate it, Thomas. I'll keep you posted. After the call, Sarah packed her things quickly, her movements precise and deliberate. The motel room felt smaller now, suffocating under the weight of her thoughts. She couldn't afford to stay in one place too long. Not while Keegan was still out there, licking his wounds and plotting his next move. Her SUV was waiting in the lot, the sunlight glinting off its freshly repaired windshield. She loaded her backpack into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat, her eyes scanning the empty road ahead. Sarah had no destination in mind, but she knew she needed to keep moving. She started the engine and pulled onto the highway, the tires humming against the asphalt. The miles rolled by in silence, the landscape shifting from rolling hills to flat plains. Sarah's mind worked as steadily as the engine, piecing together everything she knew about Keegan and the Iron Talons. If Thomas was right, Keegan's reach extended far beyond what she had seen so far. That meant he had resources he could use to track her, corner her, or worse. But Keegan had underestimated her once. Sarah was determined not to let that happen again. As she drove, a roadside diner came into view, its neon sign flickering weakly in the afternoon light. Sarah pulled into the gravel lot, her eyes scanning the handful of cars parked outside. She needed food, and more importantly, she needed information. Inside, the diner was quiet, the kind of place where regulars lingered over coffee and pie long after their meals were finished. Sarah took a seat at the counter, her posture relaxed but alert. A waitress approached, her smile warm but tired. What can I get you? Coffee, Sarah said. And whatever's good today. The waitress nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Sarah's eyes roamed the room, landing on a man seated at a corner booth. He was older, with a weathered face and a faded denim jacket. A newspaper was spread out in front of him, but his gaze kept flicking toward her. Sarah met his eyes briefly before looking away, her expression unreadable. The man didn't approach, but she could feel his curiosity from across the room. When the waitress returned with her coffee, Sarah leaned in slightly. That's Frank. He's harmless. Been coming here for years. Does Frank talk much? Sarah asked. The waitress hesitated, then smiled faintly. Only if you want him to. Sarah nodded, filing the information away. She wasn't sure yet if Frank was just a nosy regular or someone with ties to Keegan's world, but either way, she would tread carefully. As Sarah sipped her coffee, the door to the diner opened, the bell above it jingling softly. A tall man in a leather jacket stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. He froze briefly when he saw Sarah, his expression unreadable. Sarah's muscles tensed, but she kept her movements casual, her gaze shifting back to her cup. The man approached the counter and ordered a coffee, his tone low. When he turned, his eyes met hers, and he smiled faintly. "Looks like trouble follows you," he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to suggest he knew more than he was letting on. Sarah didn't smile back. Trouble only finds people who look for it. The man chuckled softly and walked to a table near the window, but his presence left a shadow over the room. Sarah knew Keegan wasn't done. His reach was already starting to creep closer. But she also knew one thing Keegan had never learned. The more you push someone prepared for war, the worse the consequences become. And Sarah was always prepared. The gravel crunched beneath Sarah Blake's boots as she left the diner and stepped into the bright afternoon sun. Her SUV stood where she had left it, but her instincts told her she wasn't alone anymore. The man from the diner, the one with the leather jacket and the faint smile, had been too deliberate in his approach, too casual in his departure. Sarah scanned the parking lot, her eyes catching the subtle shimmer of heat waves rising from the asphalt. She didn't rush. She moved with the steady purpose of someone who had been hunted before and had survived. Back on the highway, Sarah kept her speed just below the limit, her eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The man from the diner wasn't following her, not yet. But Keegan's network was bigger than she'd realized, and Sarah knew this was no longer about random bikers with grudges. Her phone buzzed, pulling her focus for a brief moment. It was a message from Peter. "Update, Keegan posted bail. Watch your back." Sarah sighed. She hadn't expected him to stay behind bars long, but the speed of his release confirmed Thomas's suspicions. Keegan had help. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Sarah spotted a gas station and pulled off the highway. The small building was nearly empty, its single pump battered and rusted. She filled her tank quickly, her ears straining for sounds beyond the chirp of crickets and the hum of the pump. Just as she replaced the nozzle, she heard it, the low rumble of motorcycles in the distance. The bikes appeared on the horizon like shadows, growing against the twilight, their riders a menacing force of leather and steel. Sarah didn't wait. She slid into her SUV and pulled onto the road, her pulse steady, her mind calculating. The bikers followed, their headlights forming a tight cluster behind her. Keegan was leading them, his familiar sneer visible even in the rearview mirror. Sarah pressed the gas, the SUV surging forward. The open road stretched ahead, a ribbon of black cutting through dense woods. She could hear the growl of the bikes closing in, their engines roaring like an approaching storm. Her eyes flicked to a narrow dirt road branching off the highway, a logging trail hidden by overgrown brush. She made the decision in a split second, swerving onto the trail and disappearing into the trees. The bikers followed, their headlights weaving between the trunks. Keegan's voice carried over the din, barking orders to his crew. "She thinks she can lose us in here? Stay close." Sarah's SUV bounced over the uneven terrain, her hands steady on the wheel. She wasn't trying to lose them, not yet. She was leading them, drawing them deeper into the woods, away from the highway, away from anyone who might get caught in the crossfire. Finally, she found what she was looking for, a clearing surrounded by dense forest. She pulled the SUV to a stop, killed the engine, and stepped out. The bikers arrived moments later, their headlights cutting harsh beams through the dark. Keegan dismounted, his crew following suit. They fanned out around her, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Well, Keegan said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this time, there's no one coming to save you." Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile. "I don't need saving." Keegan swung first, his crowbar slicing through the air. Sarah ducked, moving with the fluidity of years of training. She grabbed his wrist and twisted, forcing him to drop the weapon. The clearing erupted into chaos as the other bikers charged. Sarah fought with precision, her movements calculated and efficient. She disarmed one, using his chain to sweep another off his feet. Keegan lunged again, but Sarah was faster, delivering a sharp blow to his knee that sent him sprawling. One by one, The bikers fell. Their numbers meant nothing against her skill, and their confidence crumbled as the fight dragged on. When the dust settled, Keegan was the last man standing, or rather, kneeling, clutching his leg as he glared up at Sarah. You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. Sarah crouched in front of him, her eyes level with his. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And you don't scare me." Keegan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sarah stood and stepped back. "Here's the deal. You and your crew disappear. No more tracking me, no more games. Because if I see you again, Keegan, I won't hold back next time." The sound of distant sirens cut through the night. Keegan's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. You called them?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah shrugged. "You're not as clever as you think, Keegan. And now you get to explain yourself to the cops." Again, the police arrived moments later, their lights cutting through the darkness. Peter Jones was among them, his expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "You really don't know how to stay out of trouble, do you?" he said, approaching Sarah. Sarah smirked. "Trouble finds me, remember?" Peter shook his head, gesturing for his team to secure the bikers. Keegan was cuffed and hauled to his feet, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. As the officers loaded the crew into their vehicles, Peter turned back to Sarah. "You're leaving, aren't you?" "I have to," she said. "Keegan's out of play for now, but whoever's backing him won't stop. I need to stay ahead of them." Peter nodded, though his concern was evident. "Take care of yourself, Blake, and call if you need anything." Sarah offered a small smile. "I will." By the time Sarah reached the highway again, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. She drove in silence, her thoughts steady. The storm had passed, but she knew the road ahead was still uncertain. Keegan was just one piece of a larger puzzle, and Sarah was determined to find the bigger picture. As the miles rolled by, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She wasn't running. She was moving forward, ready for whatever came next, and she wouldn't stop until the fight was finished.